R.F. Duxford, Cambridgeshire, England, May 1943. Flight Sergeant William Bill Hutchins wipes oil from his hands and stares at the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that's been running continuously for 72 hours. 3 full days. The temperature gauges hold steady in the green zone. No smoke, no knock, no overheating. Behind him, 6 other ground crew members stand in exhausted silence, their faces streaked with grime from 3 sleepless days of monitoring fuel lines, checking oil pressure, recording temperatures every 15 minutes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The engine doesn't care that it's been running since Tuesday morning. It purrs with the same mechanical precision it had on hour 1. What they've proven in this corner of an English airfield will save hundreds of pilots over the next 2 years, but right now, Bill Hutchins is just terrified that someone in authority will find out what he's done. The modification is illegal. It violates every specification from Rolls-Royce. It contradicts explicit directives from the Air Ministry. And it works so perfectly that Hutchins knows he's either about to be court-martialed or vindicated. There's no middle ground when you've deliberately contaminated the most sophisticated aircraft engine in the Royal Air Force with an additive that regulations explicitly forbid. 3 days earlier, Group Captain James Donaldson had stood in this same hangar and delivered an ultimatum. Find a solution to the engine overheating problem, or we're grounding half the squadron. The numbers were brutal. In the past 6 weeks, Fighter Command had lost 47 Spitfire Mark 9s to engine failures during extended patrol missions over the North Sea and the Channel. Not combat losses, mechanical failures. Engines seizing mid-flight because they couldn't handle sustained high-power operations in cold, dense air at altitude. Pilots were dying because their engines quit, not because the Luftwaffe shot them down. The Merlin 61 engine was the most powerful variant Rolls-Royce had ever produced. 1,500 horsepower, 2-stage supercharger, capable of pushing a Spitfire Mark 9 to 44,000 feet. On paper, it was magnificent. In practice, it had a fatal flaw that neither the designers at Derby nor the engineers at the Air Ministry had anticipated. The oil system couldn't handle extended combat operations at full throttle in freezing temperatures above 20,000 feet. The contradiction seemed impossible. How could an engine overheat when the outside air temperature was minus 40 degrees Celsius? But that was exactly what was happening. Pilots returning from 4-hour patrol missions reported oil temperatures climbing into the red zone, oil pressure dropping dangerously low, and engines that sounded like they were tearing themselves apart from the inside. Post-flight inspections revealed scored cylinder walls, damaged bearings, oil that had broken down into a thick, useless sludge. The problem was killing engines, and engines were killing pilots. Bill Hutchins wasn't supposed to solve problems like this. He was a flight sergeant, a ground crew chief with technical training, but no engineering degree. His job was to maintain aircraft according to regulations, not to redesign the lubrication system of the most advanced aero engine in Britain. But Hutchins had spent 15 years before the war working in his family's garage in Sheffield, rebuilding car engines, truck engines, anything with pistons and crankshafts. He understood engines the way some men understood music, instinctively, completely, at a level that had nothing to do with formal education. And he'd been watching Merlin engines fail for 6 weeks while engineers from Rolls-Royce visited the squadron, took measurements, wrote reports, and promised solutions that never materialized. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The morning after Group Captain Donaldson's ultimatum, Hutchins pulled a failed engine from Spitfire EN 398. The aircraft had limped back from a patrol over the Dutch coast, with the pilot reporting severe engine roughness and oil pressure fluctuations. When Hutchins drained the oil, it came out thick and dark, nothing like the clean amber fluid that should have been circulating through the engine. He held a sample up to the light. The oil had separated, the additives breaking down under the extreme thermal stress of sustained high-power operation in thin, cold air. But that night, he sat alone in the maintenance hangar with the engine manual open in front of him. The Rolls-Royce specifications called for DTD-70 mineral oil, a straight-grade lubricant developed specifically for the Merlin. It worked beautifully at normal operating temperatures, but it had a narrow thermal range. Too cold, and it thickened. Too hot and the additives broke down. Extended operations at high altitude created a perfect storm, where parts of the engine ran cold while combustion chambers and exhaust valves ran brutally hot. The manual was explicit. Use only approved DTD 70 oil. Do not mix grades. Do not add unapproved additives. Failure to comply will void all warranties and may result in catastrophic engine failure. Hutchins thought about his father's garage in Sheffield, the old trick for racing engines that needed to run flat out for hours. You didn't just use oil, you added a small percentage of solvent to keep the oil fluid under stress, something that would thin the mixture just enough to maintain proper flow without compromising lubrication. In racing engines, they'd used toluene, a volatile hydrocarbon that evaporated at high temperatures, leaving the base oil to do its job. But toluene wasn't available at an RAF base in 1943. What Hutchins did have access to was aviation gasoline, 100-octane fuel, volatile, refined, and completely forbidden as an oil additive by every regulation in existence. He stood up, walked to the fuel storage area, and filled a small can with avgas. Back at the workbench, he mixed 15% aviation gasoline into a container of DTD-70 oil. The mixture thinned immediately, the gasoline reducing the oil's viscosity. At room temperature, it looked promising, but engines didn't run at room temperature. Hutchins knew that if he was wrong, if the gasoline caused the oil to break down faster, or if it ignited inside the engine, he wouldn't just destroy an aircraft, he'd kill the pilot flying it. And they'd probably shoot him for sabotage. He stared at the mixture for a long time. Then he made a decision that would either save lives or end his career. He would test it on the ground, not in flight. 3 days of continuous running at full power. If the engine survived that, it could survive anything a combat mission would throw at it. He requisitioned a Merlin 61 engine that was scheduled for overhaul, claimed it was for maintenance training purposes, and mounted it on a test stand in a corner of the airfield where visiting brass wouldn't notice. Then he filled the oil system with his forbidden mixture and started the engine. The modification wasn't revolutionary. It wasn't even original. Mechanics had been using similar tricks in racing and industrial applications for decades, but applying it to a Merlin engine, the most sophisticated power plant in the Royal Air Force, was either genius or insanity. Hutchins wasn't sure which. He just knew that pilots were dying, and the official solutions weren't working. The engine started smoothly. Hutchins let it warm up, then pushed the throttle to full power, 1,500 horsepower. The noise was overwhelming. The test stand shook. Exhaust flames licked from the stubs, and the oil temperature gauge climbed steadily into the operating range and held there, rock steady, hour after hour. By midnight on the first day, the engine had been running for 12 hours straight at maximum power. The oil temperature sat exactly where it should be. Oil pressure remained constant. Hutchins and his crew rotated shifts, checking gauges, monitoring fuel flow, listening for any sign of distress. The engine ran like it was designed to run, but better, smoother, more consistent, without the temperature spikes that plagued standard configurations. On the second day, word began to spread through the squadron. Flight Sergeant Hutchins has an engine that's been running for 24 hours. Pilots stopped by to watch. Other ground crew chiefs asked questions. What oil are you using? Standard DTD-70, Hutchins lied. He wasn't ready to reveal the modification, not until he was absolutely certain it worked. By the end of the second day, 48 hours of continuous operation, the engine showed no signs of stress. The cylinder head temperatures were perfect. The oil, when Hutchins drew a sample, still looked clean and amber. The gasoline had done exactly what he'd hoped. It kept the oil fluid during cold starts and at altitude, allowing proper circulation. Then it evaporated under operating heat, leaving pure DTD-70 oil to provide lubrication where it mattered most. On the third day, Group Captain Donaldson heard about the test. He arrived at the test stand in the morning, his face a mixture of curiosity and irritation. What exactly are you doing, Flight Sergeant? Testing engine endurance, sir. Under whose authority? My own, sir. Donaldson's jaw tightened. Explain. Hutchins did. He explained the overheating problem, the oil breakdown, the failed engines. He explained his theory about viscosity and thermal stress. And then, because there was no point in lying anymore, he explained the gasoline additive. Donaldson's face went pale. You added aviation fuel to the engine oil? Yes, sir. That's completely unauthorized. Yes, sir. It violates every regulation from Rolls-Royce. Yes, sir. And you've been running this engine for... Hutchins checked his watch. 68 hours, sir. Donaldson stared at the engine, still running smoothly at full power. The gauges were perfect. The sound was clean. There was no smoke, no knock, nothing to indicate that anything was wrong. How long can it run? I don't know, sir. I plan to run it for 72 hours, 3 full days. That's longer than any combat mission we fly. Donaldson walked around the test stand, examining the engine from every angle. His face was unreadable. Finally, he turned back to Hutchins. If this engine fails, they'll court-martial you. Yes, sir. And if it doesn't fail, they'll probably still court-martial you for violating regulations. Yes, sir, but it works. It appears to, sir. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So, if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Donaldson was silent for a long moment. Keep it running, document everything, temperatures, pressures, fuel consumption, everything. I need to make some calls. 4 hours later, at exactly 72 hours of continuous operation, Hutchins shut down the engine. The sudden silence was startling. For 3 days, the hangar had been filled with the thunder of 1,500 horses. Now there was only the ticking of hot metal cooling. They disassembled the engine that afternoon. Rolls-Royce engineers, hastily summoned from Derby, supervised the inspection. They examined every bearing, every cylinder wall, every valve seat. The engine was in perfect condition. Bearing wear was within normal tolerances. The cylinder walls showed no scoring. The oil, still mixed with gasoline, had maintained its lubricating properties throughout the entire test. One of the Rolls-Royce engineers, a man named Arthur Bennett, who'd helped design the Merlin, held up a sample of the oil mixture and stared at it like it had personally offended him. This shouldn't work, he said quietly. According to everything we know about lubrication theory, adding a volatile hydrocarbon should cause thermal breakdown. The mixture should separate under heat stress. But it doesn't, Hutchins said. No, Bennett admitted, it doesn't. The question now was what to do about it. The modification worked, but it violated every specification and regulation. Implementing it across the entire fighter command would require approvals from the Air Ministry, from Rolls-Royce, from maintenance commands. It would require rewriting technical manuals, retraining ground crews, accepting that a flight sergeant with no engineering degree had solved a problem that had stumped the best minds in British aviation. Or they could quietly bury the whole thing and keep losing aircraft to engine failures. That decision would be made at levels far above Bill Hutchins' pay grade. But in the meantime, pilots were still dying, and Hutchins had proven something that the experts said was impossible. The problem wasn't new. It had been killing engines since the Merlin 61 entered service in July 1942. The Spitfire Mark IX was Britain's answer to the Focke-Wulf 190, a German fighter that had terrorized RAF squadrons throughout 1941 and early 1942. The Mark IX, powered by the new 2-stage supercharged Merlin, could finally match the FW-190's performance at altitude. It could climb to 40,000 feet. It could sustain 370 miles per hour. On paper, it was exactly what Fighter Command needed, but paper didn't account for the North Sea in winter. It didn't account for 4-hour patrol missions at 28,000 feet, where the air temperature dropped to minus 50 degrees Celsius. It didn't account for pilots holding full throttle for 30 minutes straight during combat, then cruising at high power for 2 more hours on the return flight. The Merlin 61 could handle short bursts of maximum performance. It couldn't handle sustained high-power operations in the thermal extremes of high-altitude combat. The first failures appeared in October 1942. Squadron leader James Rankin of No. 611 Squadron was leading a sweep over the French coast when his engine began losing oil pressure at 26,000 feet. The oil temperature gauge climbed into the red zone despite the freezing outside air. Rankin nursed the aircraft back across the channel, the engine hammering, smoke trailing from the exhaust stubs. He belly landed in a field near Dover. The engine had seized. Post-flight inspection revealed catastrophic bearing failure. The oil had broken down completely, turning into a thick sludge that couldn't lubricate the high-speed components. Metallurgical analysis showed extreme thermal stress. Parts of the engine had been running cold, while other sections had exceeded safe operating temperatures by more than 100 degrees. The thermal gradient had literally torn the engine apart from the inside. Over the next 4 months, Fighter Command lost 47 Spitfire Mark 9s to similar failures. Not all the pilots survived. Flight Lieutenant Peter Michaels died when his engine seized at 18,000 feet over the channel. He had no altitude to glide back to England. His last radio transmission was calm, almost resigned. Engine's gone. Going in, tell my wife I love her. Squadron leader Ronald Kellett survived his engine failure, but barely. His Merlin quit at 32,000 feet during a high-altitude intercept mission. He glided 40 miles back to the English coast, his windscreen frosting over, his fuel lines freezing, the aircraft a 20,000-pound glider with no power. He touched down on a beach near Margate with less than 500 feet of altitude remaining. When ground crews examined his engine, the oil had solidified into something resembling tar. The engineers at Rolls-Royce knew they had a problem. The Merlin had been in production since 1938. Tens of thousands of engines had been built. The basic design was proven, reliable, legendary. But the Merlin 61 was different. The two-stage supercharger generated enormous heat. The intercooler system tried to manage that heat, but it created temperature differentials throughout the engine that the standard oil system couldn't handle. At altitude, the oil cooler was super efficient, too efficient. It dropped the oil temperature so low that viscosity increased dramatically. The thick oil couldn't flow properly through narrow passages and small bearings. At the same time, combustion chamber temperatures remained extreme, breaking down oil additives in the hottest sections. The result was an oil system that was simultaneously too cold in some areas and too hot in others. Rolls-Royce tried multiple solutions. They developed DTD-70A, a modified oil with improved low-temperature flow characteristics. It helped, but not enough. Pilots still reported oil pressure fluctuations and overheating on extended missions. They redesigned the oil cooler, reducing its efficiency to keep oil temperatures higher. That created overheating problems at low altitude during takeoff and climb. They experimented with electric oil heaters to pre-warm the oil before engine start. The heaters added weight and complexity, and they didn't address the fundamental problem of thermal gradients during flight. By March 1943, Rolls-Royce engineers were recommending operational limits. Restrict high-power operations to no more than 15 mean minutes. Limit patrol missions at altitude to 2 hours maximum. Avoid sustained combat in conditions below -30 degrees Celsius. Fighter Command rejected the recommendations. We can't tell pilots to stop fighting after 15 minutes because their engines can't handle it. Air Vice Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory told the engineering committee, "The Luftwaffe doesn't observe time limits, neither can we." The consensus among aviation engineers was clear. The problem required a fundamental redesign of the Merlin's lubrication system. New oil passages, larger coolers, possibly a completely different oil formulation. The solution would take months, possibly a year. In the meantime, pilots would keep dying. Bill Hutchins wasn't aware of most of this when he mixed gasoline into the engine oil. He wasn't privy to the engineering meetings at Derby or the operational discussions at Fighter Command headquarters. He just knew that engines were failing, pilots were dying, and the official solutions weren't working fast enough. What he discovered, almost by accident, was that the solution didn't require a redesign. It required understanding how oil behaved under real-world conditions, not laboratory conditions. Aviation gasoline had a boiling point of approximately 40 degrees Celsius at sea level, much lower at altitude. When mixed with oil at 15% concentration, the gasoline did three critical things. First, it reduced the oil's viscosity at low temperatures, allowing proper flow even when the oil cooler was working overtime at altitude. Second, it began evaporating as the engine heated up, gradually returning the mixture to pure oil as operating temperatures stabilized. Third, and most importantly, it created a self-regulating system that automatically adjusted viscosity based on operating conditions. At engine start in freezing weather, the gasoline kept the cold oil fluid enough to circulate immediately, preventing dry starts that damaged bearings. During climb to altitude, as the engine worked hard and generated heat, the gasoline evaporated progressively, thinning the oil where cooling was most aggressive. At cruise altitude, with the engine at steady-state operation, enough gasoline remained in the mixture to compensate for the extreme cold without compromising lubrication in the hot sections. It was elegant because it was simple. The gasoline wasn't fighting the engine's thermal dynamics. It was working with them, creating a dynamic lubricant that adapted to conditions in real time. No electric heaters, no redesigned oil coolers, no complex control systems, just basic chemistry applied with precision. But Hutchins' modification had one massive problem. It was completely unauthorized. Rolls-Royce technical specifications explicitly prohibited any contamination of DTD-70 oil. The Air Ministry maintenance regulations were equally clear. Unauthorized modifications to aircraft engines were grounds for court-martial. Even if the modification worked, even if it saved lives, implementing it required approvals that could take months. Group Captain Donaldson understood this when he made his phone calls on May 14, 1943. He called Air Vice Marshal Lee Mallory, first explained the situation and requested permission to conduct flight tests. Lee Mallory's response was immediate. Absolutely not. If that engine fails in flight and kills a pilot, it's murder. Donaldson persisted. Sir, we've already proven the modification works on the ground. 72 hours of continuous operation with perfect results. Works on a test stand, Lee Mallory snapped. Flight conditions are different. Altitude, temperature variations, G-forces, vibration. You're asking me to authorize an experimental modification based on one ground test. Do you understand the liability if this goes wrong? I understand that we're losing aircraft every week to engine failures, sir, and your solution is to violate every maintenance regulation we have. My solution is to stop the failures, sir. Whatever it takes. The line was silent for a long moment. Finally, Lee Mallory spoke. I want engineers from Rolls-Royce to examine your test results. I want metallurgical analysis of that engine. I want every bearing, every valve, every cylinder inspected and certified, and I want it all documented in triplicate. If the Rolls-Royce engineers approve, I'll consider authorizing limited flight trials. Limited trials, Donaldson repeated. 3 aircraft, sir. Volunteer pilots only. Make it 2 aircraft, and if either one experiences an engine malfunction of any kind, the trials end immediately. The Rolls-Royce engineers arrived at Duxford on May 16th. Arthur Bennett led the team, accompanied by 2 metallurgists and a lubrication specialist named Dr. Edward Hartley. They spent 6 hours examining Hutchins' test engine, taking oil samples, measuring bearing clearances, inspecting cylinder walls under magnification. Dr. Hartley was particularly skeptical. He'd spent 15 years developing aviation lubricants. The idea that a flight sergeant had solved a problem that had stumped his entire department was professionally offensive. This mixture shouldn't maintain stable lubrication properties, Hartley said, holding up a sample of the gasoline-oil blend. The volatile fraction should cause foaming, oxidation, and thermal breakdown. The additive package in DTD-70 isn't designed to work with hydrocarbon diluents. But it does work, Bennett said quietly. He was examining a bearing journal under magnification. The wear patterns are normal. Actually, they're better than normal. This engine ran for 72 hours at full power, and the bearings look like they ran for 20. How is that possible? Hutchins, standing nearby, spoke up. Because the oil never stopped flowing, sir. Normally on cold starts and at altitude, there are moments when oil pressure drops and components run dry for a few seconds. The gasoline keeps the oil fluid enough to maintain pressure continuously. No dry running, no wear spikes. Hartley turned to face him. You're a flight sergeant. Yes, sir. No engineering degree. No, sir. But you understand lubrication dynamics well enough to formulate a solution that Rolls-Royce couldn't. Hutchins met his gaze. I understand engines, sir. I don't know the theory. I just know what works. That's the problem, Hartley said coldly. You don't know why it works. You got lucky. If you're wrong about the mechanism, if there's some failure mode you haven't anticipated, pilots die. Flight Sergeant Hutchins has more practical engine experience than most of your engineering team combined, Group Captain Donaldson interrupted. He's been maintaining Merlin since 1939. He's seen more engine failures and repairs than anyone on this base. That doesn't qualify him to redesign our lubrication system. Hartley shot back. This isn't a redesign, Bennett said. Everyone turned to look at him. He was still examining the engine, his voice thoughtful. It's a field modification that exploits existing thermal dynamics. The gasoline acts as a temporary viscosity modifier that self-regulates through evaporation. It's crude, but it's not wrong. You're defending this, Hartley asked. I'm saying the evidence supports the modification's effectiveness, Bennett replied. Whether we like how it was developed or who developed it is irrelevant. The question is whether it's safe for operational use. And the answer? Bennett straightened up. Based on this inspection, I'd say yes, with proper implementation protocols and monitoring. The room erupted. Hartley argued that approving an unauthorized modification set a dangerous precedent. Donaldson countered that refusing to implement a proven solution while pilots died was criminal negligence. The debate raged for 20 minutes, voices rising, technical arguments becoming personal. Finally, Bennett raised his hand for silence. Gentlemen, this isn't our decision. We document our findings and forward them to the Air Ministry. They decide policy. But I'll state my position clearly. This modification works. It addresses a critical operational problem. And if I was still flying combat missions instead of designing engines, I'd want this mixture in every aircraft I flew. The report reached the Air Ministry on May 19th. Air Vice Marshal Lee Mallory read it twice, then called an emergency meeting with representatives from Fighter Command, Rolls-Royce, and the Directorate of Maintenance. The debate lasted 4 hours. Some argued for immediate implementation across the entire fighter force. Others demanded months of additional testing. A few suggested disciplining Hutchins for violating regulations, regardless of results. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. In the end, a compromise emerged. 2 Spitfire Mark 9s would be modified with Hutchins gasoline oil mixture. They would fly operational combat missions for 2 weeks under close monitoring. Pilots would submit detailed reports after every flight. Ground crews would inspect engines after every mission. If any problems emerged, the trial ended immediately. If the trial succeeded, broader implementation would be considered. The volunteer pilots were Squadron Leader David Glazer and Flight Lieutenant Thomas Worthington, both experienced combat veterans from Number 611 Squadron. Glazer had 23 confirmed kills. Worthington had 19. Both had experienced engine problems on previous missions. Both understood the risks. When Hutchins briefed them on the modification, Glazer's response was immediate. If it keeps my engine running, I don't care what you mixed into the oil. Just make sure it works. The first test flight launched on May the 23rd, 1943. Glazer took Spitfire EN 515 on a 4-hour patrol mission over the North Sea, climbing to 30,000 feet and maintaining high cruise power for 2 hours. He returned without incident. The engine ran perfectly. Oil temperature and pressure remained stable throughout the flight. Post-flight inspection showed no abnormalities. Worthington flew the second test aircraft the following day, conducting a high-altitude intercept exercise that included sustained maximum power climbs and multiple combat simulations. Again, no problems. The engine performed flawlessly. Over the next 2 weeks, the test aircraft flew 47 combat and training missions. Not a single engine malfunction occurred. Pilots reported better engine response, more consistent power delivery, and no oil temperature fluctuations, even during extended high-power operations. The data was undeniable. On June 7, 1943, the Air Ministry authorized implementation of the gasoline oil modification across all Spitfire Mark 9 squadrons in Fighter Command. The directive came with specific instructions. Mixing ratio: 15% aviation gasoline to 85% DTD-70 oil. Mixture to be prepared by qualified ground crew only. Oil samples to be tested weekly. Any engine showing abnormal wear patterns to be immediately removed from service. Bill Hutchins received orders to train ground crews across southern England on the proper mixing and implementation procedures. For 3 weeks he travelled from base to base, demonstrating the technique, explaining the principles, answering questions from skeptical mechanics who couldn't believe the Air Ministry was authorising them to pour gasoline into their engines. Some embraced it immediately. Others resisted, convinced it would destroy their aircraft. One crew chief at Biggin Hill refused outright. "I've been maintaining Spitfires since the Battle of Britain," he told Hutchins. "Nobody's going to tell me to contaminate perfectly good oil with fuel." Hutchins understood. He'd felt the same resistance to violating established procedures. But then he pulled out the statistics. Since implementation at Duxford, 0 engine failures, 47 missions without a single problem. Compare that to the 47 aircraft we lost in 4 months before the modification. The crew chief stared at the numbers for a long time. Then he picked up a fuel can and said, "Show me how to mix it." The proof came not in ground tests or controlled trials, but in the skies over occupied Europe, where mistakes killed you and reliability meant survival. Between June and December 1943, Spitfire Mark 9s, equipped with Hutchins gasoline oil modification, flew over 14,000 combat sorties. The engine failure rate dropped by 83%. More importantly, the failures that did occur were from battle damage or component fatigue, not oil system breakdown. July 19th, 1943. Squadron leader David Glazer leads a fighter sweep over northern France at 29,000 feet. His formation encounters 12 Focke-Wulf 190s near Abbeville. The engagement lasts 17 minutes of sustained maximum power combat, brutal high G-turns, full throttle climbs, emergency war power settings that push the Merlin to its absolute limits. Glazer's aircraft shudders under the stress. The engine howls. Oil temperature climbs but stays in the green zone. After the battle, 3 FW-190s destroyed. Glazer's Spitfire returns to base. The engine is still running smoothly. In his after-action report, Glazer writes, "Extended combat at full power, engine performance exceptional throughout, no temperature fluctuations or pressure loss. This modification has transformed the Mark 9's operational capability." August 9th, 1943. Flight Lieutenant Patricia Moorhead, one of the few female ferry pilots assigned to deliver aircraft from factories to operational squadrons, flies a newly modified Spitfire Mark 9 from Castle Bromwich to Biggin Hill. Weather deteriorates en route. She's forced to climb to 35,000 feet to clear a storm front, then maintain high power for 90 minutes in conditions of minus 48 degrees Celsius. The engine never falters. When she lands at Biggin Hill, the ground crew chief inspects the engine and finds it in perfect condition. Whatever they're doing with the oil, the crew chief tells Moorhead, it's working miracles. By September, every Spitfire Mark 9 in Fighter Command had been converted to the modified oil system. The modification spread beyond Spitfires. Hurricane squadrons adopted it. Mosquito squadrons flying high-altitude reconnaissance missions requested it. Even Lancaster bomber crews, though their Merlins operated under different conditions, began experimenting with diluted oil mixtures for cold weather operations over Germany. The statistics told the story that saved the modification from its critics. Before implementation, June to September 1942, engine failures per 1,000 flight hours, 14.7. After implementation, June to September 1943, engine failures per 1,000 flight hours, 2.4. The reduction was staggering, and it translated directly into lives saved and missions completed. But the modification's impact went beyond failure rates. It changed how pilots flew combat missions. Before, pilots had to manage engine temperatures constantly, reducing power during extended operations to prevent overheating, avoiding sustained maximum power climbs that could cook the oil system. The modification eliminated those constraints. Pilots could fly aggressively, knowing their engines would hold together. Wing Commander James Johnson, who would end the war as Britain's highest-scoring ace with 38 confirmed kills, flew modified Spitfires throughout late 1943 and 44. In his memoir, he wrote, "The difference was psychological as much as mechanical, and we stopped worrying about our engines and started focusing entirely on fighting. That confidence, knowing you could push the aircraft to its limits without mechanical failure, was worth several aircraft in terms of combat effectiveness." The Luftwaffe noticed. German intelligence reports from late 1943 noted a significant improvement in RAF fighter performance at high altitude. A captured German pilot, Hauptmann Friedrich Müller, told interrogators in October 1943, "The Spitfires are flying differently now, more aggressive. They maintain high power longer, climb faster, don't back off during extended engagements. Something has changed with their aircraft." What had changed was invisible to German pilots. They couldn't see the oil flowing through the Merlin engines. They couldn't detect the 15% gasoline, keeping that oil fluid at -40 degrees. They only saw the results: British fighters that could sustain maximum performance throughout entire missions without mechanical failure. Rolls-Royce, initially resistant to the modification, eventually incorporated its principles into factory production. The Merlin 70, entering service in 1944, included a redesigned oil system with improved viscosity characteristics across temperature ranges. The engineers at Derby would never admit it publicly, but the design incorporated lessons learned from Hutchins' field modification. The factory solution was more sophisticated, using synthetic additives rather than gasoline. But the underlying principle remained the same: dynamic viscosity adjustment based on operating conditions. By war's end, the gasoline oil modification had been used in over 9,000 RAF aircraft. It had enabled successful missions that would have been impossible with standard oil systems: high-altitude reconnaissance flights over Germany at 42,000 feet, extended combat patrols over the North Sea in winter, maximum performance intercept missions against V-1 flying bombs where sustained full-throttle operation meant the difference between success and failure. The numbers quantified what pilots felt instinctively. Between June 1943 and May 1945, Merlin-powered aircraft using the modified oil system accumulated over 2 million flight hours. Engine failure rate, 1.8 per 1,000 hours, the lowest failure rate of any high-performance piston engine in the war. Pilot survival rate in mechanical emergencies increased from 62% to 91%, largely because engines that did fail usually gave warning rather than seizing catastrophically. But perhaps the most striking testimony came from the pilots themselves. After the war, the RAF conducted surveys asking combat veterans what single technical improvement had the greatest impact on their effectiveness. The answers varied. Better radars, improved gun sights, drop tanks for extended range, but a significant number mentioned the oil modifications specifically. One pilot, squadron leader Robert Doe, wrote in his survey response, "Most technical improvements were incremental. Better guns, slightly faster aircraft, improved tactics. But the oil modification was transformative. It meant we stopped fighting our own engines and could focus entirely on fighting the enemy." Flight Sergeant Bill Hutchins never sought recognition for his work. When the Air Ministry awarded him the British Empire Medal in November 1943, the citation mentioned exceptional technical innovation in aircraft maintenance, but didn't specify the modification. Hutchins attended the brief ceremony at Duxford, received his medal from Group Captain Donaldson, and returned to work the same afternoon. He gave one interview to an RAF technical journal in 1944. The interviewer asked how he'd known the modification would work. "I didn't know," Hutchins said. "I just understood that oil needed to flow and cold oil doesn't flow. The gasoline solved that problem. The rest was just testing to make sure I wasn't wrong." "But you had no formal training in lubrication engineering?" The interviewer pressed. "I had 15 years of making engines work," Hutchins replied. "Sometimes that's better than training. Training teaches you what should work. Experience teaches you what does work." After the war, Hutchins returned to Sheffield and reopened his family's garage. He maintained cars, trucks, and agricultural equipment. He never spoke publicly about his wartime work. When aviation historians tried to interview him in the 1960s and 70s, He declined politely. I was just doing my job, he'd say. Lots of people did more important things. But the pilots who flew with his modification knew differently. In 1972, the RAF held a reunion for veterans of Fighter Command. David Glazer, by then a retired air marshal, gave a speech honoring the ground crews who'd kept aircraft flying. He mentioned Hutchins specifically, describing the oil modification and its impact. That sergeant saved more lives than most aces ever shot down Germans, Glazer said. He did it not with weapons, but with understanding. He listened to what the engines were telling him, and he solved a problem that everyone else said was impossible. Hutchins attended that reunion. He sat in the back, uncomfortable with the attention. After Glazer's speech, dozens of pilots came to shake his hand, to thank him, to tell him stories of missions they'd flown with engines that ran perfectly because of his work. One pilot, tears in his eyes, said simply, "I'm alive because you knew how to mix oil. My children exist because you understood engines." The technical legacy of Hutchins' modification extended far beyond World War II. The principle of dynamic viscosity adjustment through volatile additives became standard in post-war aviation lubricant development. Modern synthetic oils use sophisticated additive packages that adjust viscosity across temperature ranges. But the underlying concept traces directly back to that simple mixture of gasoline and mineral oil developed in a hangar at Duxford in 1943. The modification also influenced maintenance doctrine throughout the RAF and eventually NATO forces. The idea that field mechanics could develop solutions to complex engineering problems, that practical experience could sometimes outpace theoretical knowledge, became embedded in military technical training. The RAF's current maintenance manual includes a case study on the gasoline oil modification as an example of innovative problem-solving under operational pressure. Dr. Edward Hartley, the Rolls-Royce lubrication specialist who'd initially opposed the modification, wrote a technical paper in 1958 analyzing its effectiveness. The paper, published in the Journal of Aeronautical Engineering, concluded, "The Hutchins modification represents a significant moment in aviation maintenance history. It demonstrated that complex problems can sometimes yield to simple solutions when approached from a practical rather than purely theoretical perspective. Modern engineers should study this case not just for its technical merits, but as a reminder that innovation can come from unexpected sources." Bill Hutchins died in 1987 at age 73 in Sheffield. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his wartime service in one paragraph. Served with distinction as an aircraft mechanic in the Royal Air Force during World War II. No details about the modification, no mention of the thousands of lives saved, just a simple acknowledgement of service. But at his funeral, the church was filled with men who'd flown Spitfires, Hurricanes, and Mosquitoes, pilots who'd survived the war because their engines ran when they needed to. They came from across Britain to honor a mechanic who'd never fired a shot in combat, but who'd contributed as much to victory as any fighter ace. Squadron leader Robert Doe, one of the few who'd flown in the Battle of Britain and later flew modified Spitfires over France, gave the eulogy. "Bill Hutchins understood something that took the rest of us too long to learn," Doe said. "Sometimes the most sophisticated problems require the simplest solutions. Sometimes genius looks like a sergeant with a wrench and an idea. Sometimes history is made not by the weapons themselves, but by the mechanics who make them work." The congregation stood in silence for a long moment. Then, without prompting, they began to applaud. It started quietly, then grew, filling the church with sound. It was the kind of ovation rarely heard at funerals, but it was appropriate. They weren't just honoring a man. They were honoring an idea, that practical knowledge matters, that experience counts, that solutions sometimes come from unexpected places. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.